Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. Over the last few years, we have noticed an increase in the number of questions regarding democracy, its institutions, civic responsibilities, and how all of these interact and mesh. The Jackson Center's program theme this year is Democracy on Trial, and we are focused on the challenges to, pressures on, and opportunities for democracy and democratic institutions, both here in the United States and around the world. These are not new questions, and Robert H. Jackson wrote and spoke on democracy during his tenures as the United States Attorney General, United States Supreme Court Justice, and as the Chief United States Prosecutor at Nuremberg. So during this year, we will be convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, voting rights, the United States Supreme Court, and more. This year, there will be only one tea time each month on the fourth Thursday. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, friends, and colleagues, and to seek out ways for additional education and to make change in your communities. For those of you watching live, remember you can ask your questions at any time in the Facebook chat. So today I am thrilled to have these particular guests for our first 2022 Tea Time, because I think this will be a helpful orientation for our entire year. So let me introduce Staffan Lindberg, who is a professor of political science and the director of the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. He is also a founding principal investigator of Varieties of Democracy. He is the author of Democracy and Elections in Africa, published in 2006, and a co-author of Varieties of Democracy, published in 2020, as well as other books and more than 60 articles on issues such as democracy, elections, democratization, autocratization, which is a word I needed to practice saying many, many times, accountability, women's representation, and voting behavior. He is currently leading several large research projects, including failing and successful sequences of democratization, varieties of autocratization, and the case for democracy. And he also has extensive experience as a consultant on development and democracy, and as an advisor to international organizations, ministries, and state authorities. We are also joined by Kelly Morrison, who is a post-doctoral research fellow at the Varieties of Democracy Institute. Her research evaluates the connection between democratic institutions, human rights, and political violence, and is forthcoming in the Journal of Politics. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Pittsburgh in 2021. So in 1940, then US Attorney General Robert H. Jackson gave a speech on democracy where he said, "Democracy, even in the world of today, has different meanings in different contexts." And that feels like a really great place to start our conversation with both of you today. So welcome to Tea Time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I like to start each of our conversations with a little bit of groundwork so people understand where we're coming from. And so I thought obviously here to start with this would be to give our audience an understanding of why were the V-Dem Institute and the V-Dem project established.
Yeah, let me start since I was there in the founding, and I don't know, Kelly, you were not in the grad program yet even. So the Varieties of Democracy project was started in 2008-9 gradually, and it was established because we were a group of scholars, some of us in Europe, some of us in America and Latin America and beyond, who were very dissatisfied with the way the existing measures of democracy were done and what they actually measured. So without going into those, we set out to measure democracy in what we believe would be the appropriate way of thinking about democracy and how to get good measures of it. And then it took a number of years, as always with these big things, to sort of get a big enough group together and hammer out the details. And then the V-Dem Institute was gradually built between 2012 to 15, and from 2015 it really became the sort of headquarters for this large international collaboration for the Varieties of Democracy project. So to get, and the point with the institute was really to make V-Dem, or Varieties of Democracy, to have an institutional home and a headquarters that could sustain this effort over many years.
That makes sense. So I think maybe what is a basic question, but why do we need to study democracy? You know, I feel like most of our audience probably thinks they have a good handle on what democracy is. And so I would love to hear from you. And Kelly, perhaps I'll start with you, since this is a very recent study, probably a prolonged study with the PhD work, but why should we study democracy?
Yeah, sure. So I think we can think of two main reasons to study democracy. And the first is normative. So we have reason to think that democracy is a good outcome because citizens are more engaged in the political process. They have the opportunity to shape how their leaders behave, what sort of policies are going to be enacted in their country. They have more freedom to express their beliefs and opinions and organize around the causes that matter to them. And so I think from a normative perspective, these are things that we at the Institute are passionate about, and probably many of your listeners as well. And so we want to understand, what sort of institutions facilitate democratic practices, and where are these practices improving around the world, and where are they declining? And so that's what we work on at the Institute. And I think we'll talk more about this later in the conversation. But another important reason to study democracy, which we've been talking a lot at the Institute about, is because we know that democracy is also associated with a lot of good outcomes that a lot of people care about from a practical perspective. So in our Case for Democracy initiative, we show how democracy improves economic outcomes, more equality for women, more peace in terms of civil conflict and other forms of violence, and a number of other outcomes. And so it's important to understand how democratic institutions come about, also because they help to facilitate all of these other important societal outcomes.
And if I may,
please
just add a little bit to the first point. I mean, if you think about the United States, at least now with Biden back in office, is actively trying to support democracy in the world. And spend a lot of money on it through USAID and through other initiatives, National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and so on. And they need guidance of how to support democracy to develop. And in order to do that, we need to have some science on what makes countries become more democratic and what doesn't. So there is also sort of a very practical policy, practical aspect to this.
Well, and Stefan, you had mentioned in your opening conversation about why the Varieties of Democracy was created, was that there were measures that you thought better expressed or better perhaps provided guidance on democracy. And so I think, and I think this will tie into my next question as well, but I'm curious as to what some of those are. And, my recollection from my research was they can be somewhat grouped into larger categories, although there are some subsets there. But when we start talking about varieties of democracy, and I mentioned this to both of you, I think that will come as a surprise to our audience as well, that we tend to think of democracy as kind of very black and white. You either are or you're not. But that is not clearly the only way that we can look at democracy.
Yeah. So let me try and put it this way. At the national level, every type of democracy, if you like, must have the core, which we refer to as electoral democracy, free and fair, clean elections that come back, and in an environment of media freedom, so people can be informed about what the candidates want to do and what they have done if they are in office. And there's freedom of speech and freedom of association. So if you want to start a political party or you want to run for office, you can do that. That's sort of the core, the vertical accountability between voters and their elected representatives. Because at a national scale, there is no way to go around this with representatives, right? We cannot all the time, all of us, be engaged in all the political decisions that are going to have to be taken in a modern society. So we elect them, and then by way of elections, we can throw the rascals out, as it were, if we don't like what they're doing, and we think somebody else can do it better. And that's sort of the core, and every variety needs to have that core. But then there's both long traditions in the writings about democracy, going back 200 years or more, about that you can, beyond that, you can emphasize different values. And there are also different practices in the world. So in the United States, you're influenced very much by the liberal tradition in thinking of democracy. And here is the worry is that the majority will start to oppress the minority and do away with the individual liberties and that sort of thing. So you need to constrain power, right? And make sure they don't do too much. So then you have this system with presidential elections and then separate elections for Congress, right? And the Congress can exercise constraints on the executive that you are very well aware of, I guess, today, with both under Obama and then again now with Biden. You can't get your policies through. And then there's also a strong legislature with the Supreme Court that can also put limits on what the executive can do, right? And rule that certain actions are unconstitutional and all that. That's about constraining power to preserve the individual liberties. If you go to a country like the United Kingdom, they're influenced by what we call the majoritarian tradition. There, the concern is to say, okay, electoral democracy is good, but it's not enough. Because if we have too many political parties and nobody gets a majority, and you can't get coalitions together, then there are no decisions taken. And then the people are not ruling. Democracy is ruled by the people. So if there are no decisions, they are not ruling. So we need governability. So instead, they try to concentrate power, right? They have single member districts, just like you have in the United States, but in a parliamentary system, no president. And that typically means, without going into the technical details, typically means with 40% of the votes, you in the UK typically get 60% of the seats in the legislature. And every time the prime minister brings a bill to the house, it will pass, right? That's governability. Then the people are ruling, right? So it's different ideas about what's important beyond the electoral vertical accountability. And then we have other traditions. I'm not going to go into all the details and all of them maybe, but, participatory democracy, about people having some influence between elections as well, and with direct voting on issues if you can, such as they have a lot in Switzerland. And then you have, in the Northern Europe, we are much more influenced by the egalitarian tradition. And so there the idea is, okay, so you have electoral democracy, it's good, but it's not enough, because all those rights are structured by socioeconomic conditions. And I used to tease Americans with saying, if you don't have access to healthcare, equally good, high quality healthcare across the population, then with low access to healthcare, you have a higher probability of dying. If you die, you can't vote, right? So healthcare, access to healthcare structures how much of your political rights you have, right? And then we know education is another big predictor of that, and also access to some basic guaranteed income. So you're not afraid of what your employer, if you're too dependent on your employer can tell you to vote for this party, otherwise you get kicked out, right? That sort of thing. So you need a wide sort of social protection system, equality in healthcare and education, so that people's political rights are equal. So that's what the Varieties of Democracy is about, is to measure these different ideas and then their implementation in different parts of the world of what's important going beyond the sort of electoral arena.
That makes sense. So one of the reasons I thought you both would be interesting to talk to as our first speakers this year was because of a report that you started producing about 5 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. So every March, you release your analysis of democracy on a global scale. So the Democracy Report. Obviously, the most recent one we have is the 2021, although I know you're working on the 2022 version of this. But I was especially struck by the title of the Democracy Report of 2021, which is Autocratization Turns Viral. I wasn't really kidding about how often I've practiced pronouncing autocratization, just to make sure I was getting that correct. And I know that we're talking about a report that's almost a year old at this point, and obviously was focused on 2020, which was a very weird year for the global community. But I really would like to get a sense from you as to what sort of shape is democracy in on the global stage. Are we trending more democratic? Are we trending less democratic? Just would love to hear that baseline thought.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the unfortunate main finding of our most recent data is that autocracy is spreading. It's increasing around the world, both in terms of the number of countries that are autocratic, that we consider to be autocracies, and also in terms of the share of the world's population that is living in countries with autocratic governments. So, for instance, between 2010 and 2020, we saw that the share of the world population living in autocracies increased from 48% in 2010 to 68% in 2020. So this is levels of autocracy that we haven't seen since about the 1990s. So this is really a concerning development that we've been able to track in our data releases each year. So maybe Stefan wants to talk more about the findings.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is also illustrative. At the height of the spread of democracy in the world recently, which was in the mid-1990s, some listeners may just have been born around that time, but it's recent for us, right? But after the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union had fallen apart, lots of new independent states, and then that wave also spread to large portions of Africa and Asia. At the height of it, there were 72 countries in the world moving ahead, democratizing at the same time. That number in our last report was down to 16. That's a pretty steep slope downwards. And those 16 countries only are home to only 4% of the population. So they are small, tiny countries that mean very little. It's good for them and all that, but on a global scene, they don't mean that much, right? Whereas the autocratizing countries that Kelly talked about, they are typically also large countries with big populations and regional and sometimes global influence. We're talking about India, 1.4 billion people, Brazil, a big economic and political power in the whole of Latin America. We're talking about Turkey, and we're talking about Hungary, and we're talking about a country like Philippines that in Southeast Asia is very important. So large populations, big important countries that tend then to drag others with them.
Well, and let's take a step back as well, because you both have mentioned democratizing and autocratizing. And so I want to make sure that our audience understands, what does that mean in terms of how you all are looking at democracy and autocracy around the world. So Kelly, would you like to start with that explanation?
Yeah, so the primary measure that we use to assess levels of democracy is our Liberal Democracy Index. And this measures things like whether a country has elections and also how free and fair those elections are, but also, as well as Stefan was saying in discussing what the varieties of democracy are, we also measure whether individual rights and liberties are protected, and also the extent to which the executive is constrained by other branches of government. And so the main thing that we're looking at in our report each year is whether this measure that we have has changed both significantly and substantially. So these figures that we're talking about refer to changes that are significantly different from year to year in a statistical sense, but also that are changing on relatively high levels of the index as a whole. So that's what we're looking at.
So I want to hopefully put a couple of the numbers that Stefan, you just mentioned into a little bit of context to make sure I understand it. So when we talk about 16 countries at the moment democratizing, that doesn't include those who might already be listed as a liberal democracy or as an electoral democracy. Those are 16 countries that are making the shift, as Kelly's just described it, versus the 72 that were making that shift 30-ish or so years ago.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, it's a good point, and it's important to keep in mind there are sort of two ways to slice the world, if you like, right? You can either look at, oh, is this country a democracy or not now, or even a liberal democracy, or sort of just minimum democracy, electoral democracy, or is it an autocracy right now? But then you can also look at, oh, regardless of where they are, what type of regime they are, in what direction are they moving? Are they sort of flat, you know, or as in the US, over the last few years, going down, and that's the autocratizing, right? Just the opposite to democratizing. So those are two sort of different things. I was talking about the movements, and Kelly before that was talking about the state.
Perfect. Okay. So I think one other thing that struck me in the most recent report is that you are calling this the third wave of autocratization. And so I want to give our audience a little bit of context about that. So if you could give some thoughts, your thoughts on what were the first two waves, so we sort of understand where is this fitting in that global scheme.
Yeah. So when we look at the world from the 1800s and onwards, basically, you know, there was first a long, slow wave of democratizing countries, or democratization, roughly in the 1850s into then around 1920. A lot of countries in what now Europe and so on democratized. And then we had the 1920s into the 30s with the spread of fascism and Nazism in different parts of Europe, and then leading into World War II. And that was the first wave of autocratization. Right? So democracy was lost in a large number of cases. And then after the end of the Second World War, then we had this other sort of democratization wave. So a lot of countries that became free again and democratic after World War II, including then the democratization of Japan and re-democratization of Germany, and then new countries that became independent in the late 50s into the 60s in Africa and Asia. And so they democratized. They didn't necessarily become good democracies, right? But they sort of improved. And then there was another backsliding wave or autocratization wave in the 1960s into the 70s. Those were a lot of military coups in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, but also declaration of one-party states. And then the third wave of democratization, we usually say they started in 1974. That was Portugal with the Carnation Revolution, and then dictatorships also fell then across Southern Europe, so with Spain and Greece and so on, and then that spread to Latin America, and eventually then with the fall of Soviet Union, and then Africa and Asia again democratized. So that was the third wave, and then starting basically with Putin coming to power in Russia, 98, 99, the wave turned around again, right? And first in Russia, and then many of the Russian former Soviet republics slid back. And then that started to affect other countries across the world. So from around 2000, we can see now in hindsight, we didn't know then, but we can see in hindsight, we can tell that it sort of started in earnest there. And the last 10 years have really been a pronounced wave and an accelerating wave of autocratization across the world.
Is this sort of contraction and expansion normal? We're talking about waves of this, so this seems to be something that the world goes through. Is there ever a concern that there will be a wave of autocratization that we won't come out of, or so I'm trying to understand in terms of the study and what we want to do with this, what should we be learning from this expansion and contraction? Kelly, would you like
that's a really hard question because there's so much uncertainty, of course, about these macro level trends, but we do kind of see these cycles of waves. I think what's interesting is that or one thing that's interesting is the most recent wave of autocratization has been very distinct compared to previous waves. So as Stefan was saying, in previous waves, one of the most common ways that democracies broke down or transitioned to autocracy was via military coup. So this was very sudden, rapid change from a democracy to an autocratic form of governance. But what research from Stefan and others at the Institute has demonstrated is that in this more recent trend of autocratization, the process is a lot more gradual. So we're seeing increases in levels of polarization across cases and the erosion of more informal institutions, free media, and free civil society. So these are sort of the first warning signs of the most recent wave of autocratization. And then once sort of leaders with illiberal intentions come to power, then later they might start to attack more formal institutions like the judiciary or the legislature. And so I think one thing while noting the uncertainty in these processes is that your listeners might want to be aware of this pattern and attune to these sort of warning signs of autocratization and sort of, I think it's intentional actions that can curb these processes and facilitate democracy, but it requires a lot of engagement and it's not something people can be passive about.
It reminds me, there's an analogy of, I'm pretty sure it's a frog in a pot of boiling water that it doesn't realize it's being boiled because the heat turns up gradually. And so that's kind of the analogy that came to mind as you were describing this. But I also, Kelly, you were making some important points, and the 2021 report spells these out quite nicely as well. So I would love for you or Stefan to step through sort of how are we seeing autocratization unfold at the moment. You mentioned, there's first the restriction and control on the media, and then what are we seeing from there?
Yeah, so it's almost as if Vladimir Putin in Russia created a dictator's playbook back in the early 2000s. And then other leaders are following that playbook. And we know they also talk to each other and they learn from each other and so on and so forth. So it may not be coincidental. And you may recognize some of this in the United States in their very recent history. And we would not be the only ones to say that. A lot of American academics like Stephen Levitsky at Harvard and Dan Ziblatt have in their famous book How Democracies Die pointed this out. And so you have to think about if you are a wannabe dictator in a relatively democratic country, and this is sort of also a signifier or a very common thing that we see in the current wave of autocratization that we haven't seen before in history, right? That it's leaders and parties who came into power via democratic elections, not with a lot of fraud or anything, but democratically elected leaders that then start to undermine democracy and do away with it, right? And what you want to do first, I mean, what I would want to do first, if I was such a leader, is to contain and constrict and make irrelevant the ones that can sort of shout about what you're doing, and that's the media. And you saw such efforts under Trump in the United States as well. Bolsonaro is doing it in Brazil. Putin, he killed journalists just to show that, don't stick your neck out. That's what Orban has been doing in Hungary, not by sort of a lot of violent measures, but by he and his clientele controlling 98% of the media. So how much freedom of expression is there? Same with Modi in India, right? That's where you start. And then the second thing dictators, wannabe dictators, worry about is popular mobilization, right? That people go out into the street and protest and not go away. And for good reasons, because we know that's very effective as well. So the next thing you want to control is civil society and oppress them. And you can do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be killing people or that sort of thing. There are all kinds of means you can use. You can outlaw certain organizations. You can accuse them for tax fraud, and you can visit people, key people at night, and tell them to be careful and that sort of thing. So that's the sort of comes together with containing and oppressing the media, and at the same time civil society. Once you have those under more or less control, or at least contained to some extent, then you also want to make sure that you prepare the ground for further measures, right? And here's where polarization comes in. And you've seen that a lot in the United States. And that worries me actually a lot about the future for democracy in the United States. This extreme polarization. So you can make your supporters believe that if the other side win, they're basically going to kill you, or your way of life is going to disappear. They are an existential threat. Okay? Because then you have good backing from your supporters to attack those people, constrain their civil liberties. Worst case, I mean, in the extreme, think Nazi Germany putting them in concentration camps, right? Or as in Rwanda, genocide. Right? That's the sort of the extreme. But so then once you have enough polarization, then propaganda, sort of these fake news, that you can create a new story about who are the scapegoats that you're going to attack. Then you can start attacking the formal institutions, the judiciary system, undermine it, infiltrate it, put your people there. And as Kelly was also talking about, then sort of things like even the elections and stay in power even if you lose, right? That rings a bell maybe also at home in the United States, but it's sort of often the sequence, and it looks very, very similar in this recent wave of autocratization across from Philippines and Duterte to Brazil and United States and Hungary and India and so on. Turkey, of course.
To pick up on something you said, and it's something we have been thinking through here at the Jackson Center, is how either side of our political process at this point, it's a winner take all, that we seem to have lost the art of compromise, and that it's, if everybody goes home a little bit unhappy, that's probably the best result for everyone. And we seem now to, if I can't have it my way, you don't get anything of your way either. And that, for me, just as a observer and obviously participant in our democracy, I find particularly troubling that it feels like everything stalls then, as opposed to that may not be the full result I wanted, but if we're inching down the road, then that feels good.
Yeah, and not only that, you have another danger coupled with it. And I've said lately in a number of public places that democracy dies with the lies. Democracy presupposes that we have agreements on basic facts. Otherwise, if you can lie and get away with it, there is no way for that vertical accountability, even that we have elections for, to work. If the people in power, you don't know what if what is being said about them, and what they have done in office, what they want to do, is the truth or not. If that truth basis disappears, the whole basis for a democratic process and a democratic dialogue evaporates. And you cannot have democracy in a world of lies, so-called fake news.
You know, as someone from the US, it's very evident this disagreement, as you're saying, about what truth is, and actually the facts of the political process are contested, and this prevents democracy from functioning. And I think that's closely related with something that Kristen was saying, which is really high levels of polarization. And I think it's something that you can feel in the US, this animosity toward political opponents and the inability to even have conversations across the political divide. And I think that's what sets the foundation for the willingness for people to even disbelieve anything their opponents are saying. So they're really closely related, this high levels of polarization, and then the expectation that your opponents don't have access to truth, or you're not likely to believe what they say. So I think all of these trends are interrelated, and in the process of autocratization we're seeing around the world, and then especially in the US as well.
So I do think within the United States that there are a number of things that you just laid out that people will recognize. And I think for me, one of the questions then becomes, well, what do we do about that? So, if we're maintaining vigilance, what can we do in order to help reverse those trends?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. I think I'm not sure. I know that there is an answer to what to do about polarization. I think one thing that I'm convinced is that we need to find, and this is not only the United States, this is on a global scale, we need to find an answer to the question of how to limit freedom of expression in order to save it. So the parallel here is after World War II, and we had Nazi parties and fascist parties and associations that then did away with democracy. Then the question was, how do we limit freedom of association in order to save it? Different countries came up with slightly different solutions, but that was what to grapple with. Germany, for natural reasons, went the farthest, right, with a constitutional court and very tight restrictions. I mean, if you wear a Nazi symbol in Germany, you go to jail. It doesn't happen in the US. So but today, freedom of expression is used to undermine it, both by spreading lies and so-called fake news, or what is it, alternative facts, which is a contradiction in terms, but also by threatening people. I don't know how many emails I'm going to get after this, but I've been sort of attacked by both by Trump people and by Erdogan's people in Turkey and Orban's people in Hungary for things I say, to silence. And you, as a journalist, probably know this. When we know journalists across the world are increasingly being attacked, harassed, and also killed. Look at what's going on in Mexico, because of what they write. So it's both the spread of conspiracy theories and false facts and that undermine democracy, but also using all these media for freedom of speech to attack and intimidate people not to speak. So somehow, I don't have the solution of how, but somehow freedom of expression must be limited if we're going to save it and save democracy.
That will be a challenging concept for a lot of people, because I think that freedom of expression is one of those hallmarks that we think of with democracy. And so to the concept of limiting it in order to preserve it seems disassociated there. So that's certainly something for us to consider. One of the things that I also found interesting in the report was the conversation around the rule of law. And we have a tendency globally to think of the rule of law as always a positive concept. And we spend a fair amount of time here at the Jackson Center, and this will not be new to our audience, that is not always the case. So as you both have been talking about autocracies and the autocratization, that a lot of that also comes about through changing the laws in order to make that behavior or make those repressions legal. And so how does the Varieties of Democracy Institute think about the rule of law?
I mean, we measure the rule of law with a number of indicators. If courts are impartial and treat people equally, if there's access to justice and that sort of thing. So generally, in a democracy, it's a good thing, right? A democracy without a functioning rule of law is not as good of a democracy, if you like, as one with functioning rule of law. And it opens up for corruption and all kinds of things. Now, there's maybe never been a country with a stricter or more effective rule of law than Nazi Germany. Okay, so a dictatorship with a very strong rule of law can also use it for its own purposes. And countries going in that direction, and this Kelly talked about earlier, the changes when countries autocratize and become less democratic or more autocratic are typically done by legal means. So to give you a concrete example, Erdogan in Turkey has not necessarily broken the constitution at any point. Since 2005 and around 2015, Turkey was no longer a democracy. It's become even worse now. But he changed the constitution twice by way of a referendum, with lots of propaganda and control over the media and control over civil society. He could get those referenda to change the constitution the way he wanted, so as to solidify and concentrate power in his hands. So Yes, I mean, rule of law is, you may look upon it as a tool. Like with a hammer, you can build a nice house, but with a hammer, you can also break somebody's head.
Yeah, I would say I can just add on thinking about the U.S. case in particular. As Stefan was saying, one of the aspects in the sequence of autocratization in this contemporary wave is restricting the rights of everyone to participate in the political process, so that basically the political system, the electoral system, would benefit a particular actor, a particular party. And I think that's something in the U.S. case we should be really attuned to, is restrictions on the right to vote. That, as you were saying, sometimes these changes are very gradual, such that not everyone would even notice that they were happening or what kind of consequences they would have. But restrictions on the ability to access ballots, to access polling centers, and these sorts of freedoms and basic aspects of the electoral process, I think, are really essential to continued democratic governance.
That makes good sense. That is certainly something that was top of mind for me as well. I'd like to turn to a new endeavor for you all, which is the case for democracy, and learn about this new project that you started last year, and really get a sense of, I think one of the questions, and you both spoke to this in the intro, was, sort of, what is democracy good for? And then what is the case for democracy planning to look at this year?
Yeah, I mean, the background for this, the case for democracy, is about collating and gathering all the scientific evidence that's out there about ways in which democracies have dividends for regular people. In concrete terms, outside of ensuring our civil liberties and political rights, but health and economics and so on. And the background was really that a lot of agencies, USAID, for example, or the European Commission, and so on, and in turn to us, we have lots of interactions and said, what's the counter narrative to China? China is pushing their model of development without democracy, although now they call themselves a democracy. I saw in a white paper recently after the Biden summit, a true democracy, or that works. But regardless, they were pushing their model and saying, we're doing better. Look at our infant mortality is going down. Our economic growth is fantastic. We're building all these houses, industries, blah, blah, blah. What's the counter narrative to that? So that's where we started to gather what evidence is out there, and the really top-notch scholars across the world that work in different fields. And the results are very clear. I can just mention with economic growth, that's been a long-standing debate for 60 years or so, but it's really now enormous amounts of evidence and very rigorous studies showing that democracies are better at producing economic growth than autocracies. The autocracies tend to become poor and very badly managed, and bad for capital, and bad for industrial growth and all that sort of stuff. There are a few exceptions, but they are exceptions, right? And just talking about China as an exception, well, China under dictatorship in the last 20 years have been pretty successful, but it wasn't that successful economically under Mao Zedong, right? So even within the same country, different periods. And countries that democratize, if you compare to what would have happened if they didn't democratize, just as an example, they have a 20% higher GDP per capita growth over the following 2 decades than they would have had otherwise, right? And that's pretty significant for ordinary people. And there are many other results here. Kelly, you can just fill in.
Yeah, so I'll say I would point any listeners to our website. We have all these policy briefs published, and they're outlining sort of the cutting edge research, but in a really accessible way. So I think that's a great resource for anyone who's interested in the case for democracy. But we look not only at economic growth, but also at outcomes for the climate and other environmental outcomes. We look at the effect of democracy on civil conflict and other also forms of interpersonal violence. And then we're looking, you had asked what's coming up. So just to preview some of these new policy briefs that we've been working on, are looking at the effect of democracy on, for instance, data access and transparency. So we find that not only do democracies release more data to their citizens about actually what's going on in government and what sort of economic patterns are happening, but also that data that they produce is more accurate. So we know that autocratic governments tend to lie about even their GDP per capita and other forms of economic output. And so in democracies, we know that those outcomes are better. So that's one new thing that we're working on. Also the outcomes of education, corruption, and all sorts of things. So I really encourage listeners to take a look at those resources.
No. So just to illustrate on the health side, what Kelly was talking about, there's very robust evidence that been published in the top journals like the Lancet #1 in medicine, that going from dictatorship, sort of worst kind of dictatorship, to the best kind of democracy leads to a reduction in infant mortality by 94%. 94%. I mean, that's pretty important to people. It tends to be like if your kid die as an infant, it matters to you, right? So these are examples of some very concrete dividends that democracy comes with.
All right, before we get to our lightning round, and if the audience has any questions, I'm going to ask you if there's anything you'd like to preview in the 2022 democracy report, since I know you are working on that and it's only a few weeks from release. I hope that doesn't give either of you a nervous breakdown when I say that. But is there anything you would like to preview for us in the 2022 report?
No, we can't. And for the very simple reason that some of the data is still being processed. It's a very rigorous process of calculating and then checking all the data that comes in, and we're talking about 30 million data, so it takes a while, and so we don't have the results yet.
Okay, all right, so let me turn to our lightning round then. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. What do you wish people were paying more attention to?
Yeah, I think sort of along the themes that we've already been talking about, but in the US and also around the world, I think one of the most concerning things that's happening in democracies is the inability of different actors to accept the results of elections. And I think that's true in the US, but also in other cases that are turning towards autocracy. So I think people should pay attention to the outcomes of elections and accept the results. This is a key hallmark of democratic governance.
Okay. Stefan?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, then Stefan, I'll start with you on this one. What would you name as the greatest threat to democracy at this point?
China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the spread of lies and misinformation uncontrolled in social media and alternative media and what you want. Those are the sort of, and maybe, we don't know for sure, but maybe also this enormous increase in inequality across the world since basically the mid-1980s, but getting very extreme at this point.
Okay. Kelly?
I would say polarization and also misinformation, and especially the combination of those two is a major threat.
Okay. Kelly, I'll start with you on this one. What are some of the greatest opportunities for democracy or democratic institutions or those studying democracy?
Sure. I think the flip side of high levels of polarization around the world is that we have a great opportunity to establish communication across political divisions and pro-democracy coalitions. So I'd love to see actors, even with diverse policy goals, unite around a pro-democracy cause. And I think that's an opportunity.
Okay, Stefan?
The greatest opportunity for turning this wave of autocratization around and spreading democracy again in the world is popular mobilization. People organizing themselves and being on the streets and in big numbers. That's historically, and evidence shows, is the best. And at this point, I also think democratic states that are still democracies in the world need to get together and stand up together against autocracies and the autocratization.
Okay. Who else is doing interesting work? And Stefan, I'll start with you on that one.
Besides the V-Dem team.
But always, we are always here for the self-plug, so by all means.
Yeah. Oh no. There's also there a wide variety of scholars and institutions doing very important and interesting work. Over there, close to you in DC, you have the Carnegie Foundation. They put out a lot of good work on this. And the scholars I mentioned already, Steve Levitsky, Dan Ziblatt, there are many others.
That's great. Kelly, anyone you want to add to that list?
Well, I'll have a self-plug if Stefan wouldn't do it. But I think what people might not know is we obviously have our team at V-Dem that work here at the Institute, but we have, hundreds of scholars around the world who are using our data and publishing really exciting research about democracy around the world. So if you go to our website, you can actually look at, we have working papers published. So this is, research that's hot off the press or in progress from scholars not only here at V-Dem, but also who are working with our data. And I think that's a really great resource as well for listeners.
Okay. And then the last thing is we always like to leave our audience with something to learn or something to listen to or think about. So I will ask you both for some suggestions on that. Who should we be reading, listening to, podcasts, whatever it is? And Kelly, I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. So I'll just say this again. We both mentioned this work, but the book "How Democracies Die" by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt is a great resource and particularly timely for the U.S. case. So I think that's essential reading on democracy and contemporary autocratization.
Okay. And Stefan, who would you add to that?
Yeah, I second that. I would also add, if you're interested in these threats to democracy in the world, and a very passionate and well-informed take on that by Larry Diamond, "Ill Winds," that came out just the other year. So that's also to be recommended, I think, among many. There are many we could mention.
Well, and feel free to email me some of those as well. We often put together a little reading list or a listening list for our audience as well, so they have other resources to tap into. So I would like to thank you both. Let me do a quick program announcement. So on February 16th, we will be celebrating Jackson Day in Warren. Professor Matt Stylen, who is a professor at the University at Buffalo School of Law, will be helping us commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Steele seizure Supreme Court case here in the United States. That really, Jackson's concurring opinion in that really laid out the rubric under which we analyze presidential and executive power still today. So he will be talking at the Warren County Courthouse. So if you are in the area, please feel free to join us. It is a free program. It will be February 16th at 7 p.m. If you are not here locally, you can sign up on our website. We will send you a Zoom link so you can participate remotely, but we look forward to that. And then our next tea will be the fourth Thursday in February, February 24th, also at 3 p.m. Eastern. So look forward to seeing you then. Staffan and Kelly, thank you so very much for joining us for tea today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.